Hey everyone, today we are going to go over the best way to invest 200K in real estate. My name is Sujata Shyam, and I'm the CEO and founder of Lux Capital Investment Group. And I'm really, really stoked to be here with you today, sharing what I consider to be one of the most exciting ways to invest and grow your money. And today we're going to be taking an honest look at buying versus renting. And the point of this exercise is to show you that you can do an analysis like this. Of course, the market that you're in is going to have different numbers, and the houses that you are interested in buying are going to have different numbers. But today we're pretty much going to look at a couple and a scenario where they choose to buy a single family home. And the second scenario that we're going to look at is where they choose to rent a single family home. Rent an apartment or a single family home. And at the same time, they will be investing using the money that they would have spent on their down payment, and they're going to be investing it in syndications. So let's get started with the scenario. We've got a couple. They are thinking, okay, we have jobs now. We're maybe ready to buy a house. People are telling us we should buy a house. So they save up 200K. They live in kind of an expensive market. So they choose a house that is priced at $1 million. In their case, let's just say they put down $200,000. They had a loan amount of $800,000. And their loan term is 30 years. The interest rate is 4%. Of course, we all know that interest rates move around, but let's just say it's 4%, sort of an average and actually pretty low interest rate, historically speaking. And that results in a monthly payment of $4,295. I've included property taxes as well as principal, insurance, and interest. And, of course, different markets are going to have different property taxes. And, depending on the property you're going to buy, it's going to have different insurance. However, this is a sort of relatively reasonable ballpark estimate of $4,295 for a monthly payment. Okay, so that's scenario one. And in scenario two, they instead decide to rent an apartment or a home. And instead of investing that 200K in their home, they're going to invest that 200K in a real estate syndication, which is a group investment. It's a way that everyday investors like you and like me can own apartment buildings. And we actually don't have to have the responsibilities of running the apartment buildings. So, a lot of times there's a misconception that it's REITs or hedge funds or just really, really wealthy people that own apartment buildings. Actually, things have changed, and everyday investors, as well as, people who have high net worth, everybody can invest in real estate syndications and own a piece of an apartment building or a piece of a self-storage facility or a piece of an industrial facility. And really, there are just so many options out there. So in the second scenario, they decide to rent the home and invest that $200,000. And in that case, we're going to look at what that gives us. So in a syndication, a typical average return is an 8% cash flow during the life of the whole period. And looking at round numbers, like a typical equity multiple might be 2x. So you would double your money in 5 years. And monthly rent, we're going to say, is $3,000 to rent their, 3-bedroom apartment, let's say. Okay. So now we're going to check out what happens in scenario one. So in scenario one, Will and Grace, they are getting ready to buy a house. It has a monthly payment of $4,295. And thankfully, they both have well-paid jobs. And so that is manageable. Eventually, they decide to have children. So they have one kid and they have another kid. And then in 5 years, they find out that the roof needs to be replaced. Another year later, they need to replace the hot water heater. They decide they want a deck. And so they invest in their house and put a deck out. And at some point, they decide they need to get a bigger home because their family is growing and the kids are getting older and they're sort of outgrowing their space. So what happened financially in that situation? Well, we're going to assume that their house, their $1 million house, appreciated at a rate of 4%. So after 10 years, the house was worth $1,480,000. And of course, they have been paying their mortgage for the last 10 years. So we're going to estimate that about $200,000 is down to pay down their principal, equity pay down. 10 years is a significant amount of time. And another $15,000 has gone to paying interest, property taxes, insurance. So that's just expenses, not money that is going to be adding to the equity that they own in the house. So that is scenario one. If they sell now, let's talk about what that will look like. So they'll get back their $200,000 down payment. They'll get back the $480,000 in appreciation that occurred because the house was worth $1 million when they bought it, and then it was worth $1.48 million when they sold it. And they'll also get $200K back because they paid down their mortgage that much. So there is $200K more left that they own of the property that they don't have to pay back to the bank. So what does that equal? That equals $880,000 in their pocket, right? Well, not quite, because during that time period, they did have expenses related to the house. So they had $315,000 that they had to pay in order to maintain the house. And that is in the form of interest, taxes, and insurance. That's money that went out the door, but did not add to the equity of the house. And then they also spent $50,000 on their house over 10 years, which, depending, for $1 million house is really not that much. A roof and a couple of other house projects and, hot water heater, things add up pretty quick. So $50,000, I think, is a very, very reasonable amount that people might spend on their house in 10 years. And so that adds to expenses of $365K, which means they had net gains of $515,000 after 10 years, which sounds pretty good, right? I mean, $500,000 is sounds like a pretty good amount of gains. Okay, so what about scenario two? So in scenario two, Grace decides that she's not sure about home ownership. She's always kind of bucked the trend, and she's decided that she would prefer to rent instead of buy. And she wants to invest her money instead of put it into a down payment. So just as a thought exercise, let's see what that is going to look like. So she and Will find a great 3-bedroom apartment near lots of amenities for $3,000 a month. And they have no maintenance, no HOA fees, and no capital expenditures. So they do not have to pay extra to maintain their property. They learn about syndications, and they love the idea of compounding their wealth through real estate without having to be a landlord. So they invest that $200K in a syndication instead. Now let's look at how that works out. So a typical syndication may have an 8% preferred return, ballpark, which would equal $1,333 per month, which equals $16,000 per year. And, if they were to hold the deal for 5 years, then that $16,000 would equal $80,000 over the course of 5 years. However, after 3 years, they find that the investment is exiting early. Most syndicators are, not always, but many syndicators are trying to exit earlier. We always project deals on a 5-year timeline, but syndicators are often trying to get in, execute the business plan, stabilize the property, and sell, because we're forcing appreciation. We're not just waiting for the market to appreciate. We're forcing appreciation. We want to sell. Not everybody, there are different philosophies, but oftentimes there are syndicators who want to sell the property and then reinvest into another deal and keep the velocity of capital moving. So in this case, in this example, they find out that the investment is exiting early. They get their $200,000 back. They had earned $48,000 in passive income, and they also had made $122,000 on the sale. So that equals a total of $170,000 in profits. And that's cash flow the $48,000 plus the gains of $122,000. So 200,000 plus 170,000 is $370,000. That's what they have now. And they take all of that and they invest it into another syndication. This time it doubles in 4 years, turning it into $740,000. Pretty cool. Next, they are really enjoying their apartment. They still are really happy there. And they decide, and they have loved investing in syndication so far. So they decide to do it again. They take their $740,000 and in another 3 years, they end up with $1.4 million. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how all this works, but just let's keep in mind, first of all, this is not, they did still have expenses during this time. They had rent, right? They paid rent. And this whole time they were, let's just say that we were including a 3% annual rent increase, which means they would have paid a total of $415,000 in rents over the last 10 years. Okay, so now let's compare the two scenarios. So in scenario one, Will and Grace started with $200,000 that they invested in their house. Then after 10 years, their house earned $480,000 or grew. The value grew by $480,000. And they also paid down their principal by $200,000. So if you add that together, that equals 200 plus 480 is 680 plus 200 is $880,000 in equity that they have in their house and that they captured when they sold it. However, they did have to shell out some money in order to get that $880,000, right? They had to shell out $315,000 in interest, tax, and insurance, which are just expenses that they're never going to get back. And they paid $50,000 in repairs, which again is a very conservative amount for most people who own $1 million house. To spend only $50,000 over 10 years is actually like very, very little probably. So that's what it cost them during the life of the whole period. So that totals $365,000. So their net gain is $515,000. That sounds pretty good, right? But let's look at scenario two. What happened there? So in this case, Will and Grace also started with $200,000 and they invested that. After 3 years, they had profits of $170,000. And then they invested in syndication number two. In another 4 years, they had profits of $340,000. And in year 10, they had exited their third syndication, which doubled to $690,000. So, well, it didn't quite double, but it had profits of $690,000. That leaves them with a total of $1.4 million in their pocket. Okay, but they still had an expense, right? They had the expense of rent, which left their pocket over the last 10 years. And that cost them $415,000 in rent. So what was their net gain though? Their net gain is 1.4 minus 415,000 is $985,000. So they earned $985,000 instead of $515,000 when they rented and invested in syndications. And I think what this reflects is the power of snowballing, right? We're able to compound our investments when we invest in syndications. They grow much faster, whereas in scenario one, the investment's growing at 4%, whereas in syndications, we're actually growing the capital around 15 to 18% sometimes. And so the capital, the velocity of capital is moving much more quickly. So if you can get your equity working at a place where it's moving really quickly, then where you can compound that growth very quickly, it's very, very powerful. Now, there are definitely some caveats, right? So let's look at some assumptions that we've talked about. So we've assumed that the appreciation rate on the single family home is 4%. Now, we all know that there are times of boom when appreciation moves much, much more quickly. For example, during the time of COVID, and it also went up quite. Real estate has also gone up quite a lot since 2012, and then it went up even more when COVID hit. Right. However, if you look at real estate, it is not necessarily going to always go up at such a really huge rate. It's really hard to time the market. And that's one of the reasons why I like syndications, is because we're not trying to time the market, although we may benefit from that. We're forcing appreciation. So we're executing a business plan, we're adding value, which allows us to actually force appreciation rather than hope that we catch that, steep curve in in market appreciation. So we've assumed 4%, which is a very, very reasonable. It's not like a conservative. Conservative appreciation rate would be more like 2%. So 4% is like, that would be a very pretty solid appreciation rate. And the other thing that we're assuming is that the syndications are going pretty well, not necessarily, ridiculously well, but we're assuming that the economy has not done anything totally crazy. We're assuming that the syndicators are able to execute their business plan and get in and then sell and turn the property in an efficient way. So not all syndicators are necessarily going to be oriented towards this or able to do this. So that's another reason another place where I come in is, my goal is to find the best operators who are able to reliably execute these business plans. Of course, there's no guarantees, but one of the assumptions that we're making is that the syndications performed very well, and not necessarily extremely well. So in both cases, with the appreciation rate of 4%, that's not conservative, but it's also not ridiculously optimistic. And that's the same with the syndication performance. If a conservative look would have been more like, all those deals would have exited on a 5-year time horizon instead of 3 and 4 years. Some other considerations that we want to take into account. So in example one, they had a huge home loan. So they had a $4,295,000 payment every month. And they also had potential expenses and liability if there's a big expense or something. Whereas in scenario 2, they just had $3,000 in rent payments and no potential surprises and not a big, large home loan. So, when they both had jobs, that was very good. And, they could reliably make it. But what if somebody got laid off? A lot of people got laid off during COVID, and you can get your job back, but there might be a period of time where you don't have a job. There might be a period of time where you want to stop working to take care of kids, or to take care of an aging elder, or to take care of somebody else in your family that needs support, or you just want to take time off and reset because you're burnt out. So there's lots of reasons why people might take a break from working. So you don't necessarily want to max out your mortgage payment. It's much, much better if it feels very comfortable and if you can spend just one income on that. The other thing is liability. So with the syndications, your only liability is the capital. You're a limited liability partner when you invest in a syndication. Whereas on the home loan, your assets are on the line. And so if something happens, and if this is maybe more relevant, if it's a rental property, then you may be sued. Or if you have a rental property, then that you can't make the payments on that, then the bank could potentially, if you had a personal guarantee on it, may be able to take your house back. And so that's just another consideration, is that when you're investing in syndications, your liability is limited. And the last thing is taxes. So we didn't talk about taxes, and that was kind of left out of this analysis, but it should just be stated that when you invest in real estate in a passive way, rather than then there are very, very great tax benefits that can help keep that money compounding. So you can defer gains, you can defer paying taxes on the gains, and things of that nature that can keep your wealth compounding for you, rather than rather than having to take a big hit and not being able to allow it to grow as quickly. So the tax benefits are just really phenomenal in investing in syndications too. So that is, we'll go back to this tab just to look at the scenario again. So just to sum up, in what happened in this situation is that in scenario one, they were building equity at 4% per year, which is not bad, but that equity was tied up in the house and it wasn't able to keep compounding. Okay, so that's factor number one. Number two is that they have expenses that are tied to their home, which are not actually contributing to building equity, depending on how you look at it. So, you still have expenses, maintenance, interest, tax, and insurance that you have to pay when you own a home. And the bigger home you buy, the more that is usually. In scenario two, the capital is able to continue working and it's working all of the time. And so rather than having to pay to be having a property that's appreciating at 4%, you invest in a syndication and you have no work and your money is turning over at a rate of 15 to 18% or something in that range. And the velocity to capital can move so much more quickly. I mean, of course, it's actually growing much faster in this time horizon. When the syndications go well, this is what it's going to look like. So, there's a common American dream that you got to buy a house to start earning money and stop throwing rent away. And I just wanted to provide this as an example of why it might be more financially advantageous to rent and invest instead of buy a home. So thank you very much. And we'll take questions now. Again, this is not advice, and please, this is just for educational purposes. Please do your own analyses in your own situation. And actually, I want to hear about it. Tell me what you find and let's talk about it. So thank you so much. Really great seeing you all here today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.